So I'm Father Steve Mulverick. I teach church history here at the Klaus School of Theology and Ministry, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all here for this retrospective on Brad Gregory's Salvation at Stake. And so I need to introduce somebody, Irini de Saint-Sernin, who's the Director of Philanthropy for the Bollandist Foundation in Brussels. And I'd welcome Irini to the podium to tell you a little bit about what they do.
Good evening. I think you all know the Bollandists, right? The Bollandists are a remarkable group of mostly Jesuit scholars who have devoted centuries to the rigorous examination of saints' lives. They continue to be held in the highest regard for their unwavering commitment to this field and their enduring legacy in the world of scholarship. You must realize from my opening lines that I do not usually address a room full of remarkable academics, but rather potential benefactors. Otherwise, I would have shown a little bit more humility. What I truly want to tell you, however, is that the Bollandists and I thank you from the bottom of our hearts. You have gone out of your way to help us make our case heard and ensure our work continues. Personal friendships have been forged, and your support has been invaluable to me. For that, and for making it possible for the unique institution that the Bollandists are to be passed on to the next generations, I will never thank you enough. Thank you for hosting us this evening.
Dr. Tom Santamaria, who's at Sattler College in downtown Boston, who's a student of Carlos Ayer, who's a previous speaker in this series, and was a Yang Fellow at Harvard Divinity School, and has an award-winning article in the Catholic Historical Review on former Jesuits in the early modern period. So Tom will be kind of emceeing the event, so I welcome him to the podium.
Thank you, Steve, for a generous introduction. And I'm very grateful to you for asking me to be here, as well as to Irini and to the Bollandists for inviting Professor Gregory from the University of Notre Dame to Boston College tonight. I will spare you the jokes. No doubt someone else can make them about Boston College and Notre Dame. In any case, we have an exciting opportunity to hear from our panelists and Professor Gregory tonight. He is a distinguished scholar of Western Europe in the Reformation, whose notable publications include, of course, tonight's Salvation at Stake, The Unintended Reformation, and timed well for the Luther year, no doubt, Rebel in the Ranks, Martin Luther, the Reformation, and the conflicts that continue to shape our world. More recently, Professor Gregory has been investigating the relationship between Western Christianity and our global environmental realities. I'll keep this alive for him, maybe. Okay. As we all await the way of the world, power, wealth, and civilization from the last ice age to the Anthropocene, I wanted to offer a personal word about the deep influence his work has had on so many of us and myself in early modern studies. By command of Carlos Ayer, and to my great delight, all of Professor Gregory's books were on my comprehensive exam list. In the course of my education as a historian, one concept was sort of hammered home all the time. You need to have a so what. So I don't want to steal any of Professor Gregory's thunder, but I think what he's offered time and again in his career as a historian is a so what, a model for how to do history. And if anyone asks you, why study religious history from 500 years ago? What better answer is there than people died for it? So with that, I'll welcome Professor Gregory.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks very much, Steve. For those of you who know Father Mulverick, Steve, will know that he is a meticulous planner and organizer. And the way in which he step by step organized this, my visit is really quite remarkable. So I just want to thank him for that. I also want to single out and thank Irini for the co-sponsorship of this particular panel this evening from the Société des Bollandistes, and the remarkable centuries-long tradition of hagiographical scholarship that they've been involved with. Finally, I want to thank the three respondents, my colleagues, who are going to offer some remarks after I talk for a few minutes here. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for turning out this evening. I mean, I know there's really not very much going on in the Boston area on a Thursday night, so this is probably just figured, might as well go hear this guy say a few things. Well, I'm going to, this evening, I'm going to talk for just a few minutes and say a few things about the kind of where the book came from. Salvation at Stake was the revision of my doctoral dissertation. I'll say a little bit about the genesis of the book. Then, on the off chance that maybe a few of you haven't reread a 500-page book in the last week, I'm going to talk about basically the argument and the overview of what the book is about, how it's structured, and what its order is. And then at the very end, I'm just going to say just a few retrospective reflections, kind of in light of some more current developments. But really, this is meant to be informal, and it's meant to be kind of just it's a strange experience. At least it has been for me. When one gets 30 years or so removed from the research and the writing of one's own work, because to go back and reread it, I find myself thinking, I don't even remember that paragraph, but I guess I wrote it because I don't think somebody else, interposed themselves and did. So this is just meant to be kind of informal, and also, quite frankly, I'm trying to get better at speaking informally or more or less from slides. So that's what you got from me this evening. So let me just say a few things then about the where the book came from and what kind of the trajectory was as I was trying to come up with a dissertation topic and settle on this. I came to the PhD program at Princeton, which is where I did my doctorate, most immediately from a master's program at the University of Arizona, where I was influenced by and worked with the late Heiko Obermann, a great Reformation scholar. And in Heiko's seminar, I mean, it was never any question about taking religious convictions and theology in context and all this very seriously. And I got to Princeton, and I was reading, for the first time, really lots of scholarship that in the late 80s and early 90s, in various ways, I would say the first theoretical move almost always was a reductionist approach to religion. Religion was always something else. It was really about social control, or it was about a kind of psychological way of coping with a materially and power differential difficult world, or it was constructed for ways A, B, and C, and so forth. And it just it bugged me. I mean, I knew too much about early modern Christians, especially. I don't know other religious traditions very well, but I knew quite a lot about early modern Christianity. This just didn't seem right. This did a kind of interpretative violence to the people who lived in the 16th century, what they were about, what they cared about, and so forth. So that was kind of like, I was looking for a topic that would allow me to critique what seemed to me reductionist interpretations of Christianity in the early modern period. And it was an offhand comment in a reading course by Peter Brown, a really great reading course, just me and one other student taking up all of Peter Brown's office hours for an entire semester at his insistence. I think probably his other graduate students were really pretty angry about that, because they would knock on the door and say, "Sorry, I'm occupied." So, but we were talking about the Iberian Franciscan, Raymond Lull, who was, I'm sure some of the medievalists especially know, Raymond Lull was particularly convinced about the rational demonstrability of Christianity vis-a-vis Islam especially. He thought the Trinity could be rationally demonstrated, for example. So we just had to get to, majority Muslim regions and start to demonstrate, and they would, and so Raymond Lull goes to the Holy Land, and Peter Brown is telling the story, and he says, and he was promptly stoned to death. And then Peter said, and this is the single line, literally, that sparked the entire dissertation and eventually became this book. He said, but back in Europe, no one batted an eyelash. And I thought, that's really interesting. You've got a Franciscan killed by Muslims, but he's not celebrated as a martyr. Not really much is done about him at all, which means there's a disjunction between a willingness and the fact of somebody dying for their explicit religious convictions, missionary activities, and so forth on the one hand, and the way in which they are interpreted or not as a martyr. Now, at the time, I was reading for my exams, and I knew about John Fox, his Acts and Monuments, Book of Martyrs. I knew about Thomas More and John Fisher and Edmund Campion, these English Catholic martyrs. And I also knew something about the Anabaptist martyrological tradition, especially the huge Dutch compilation of the 17th century, the Martyr's Mirror. And I started to just ask questions about, well, what did it mean and how did that work in the Reformation era, that you have people from these distinct traditions who are demonstrating their willingness to die for their respective convictions. How did that work out? What was the discourse around it and so forth? And what I found was that you had three quite heavily developed but traditionally heavily confessionalized historiographies, understandably celebrating essentially, respectively, Protestant, Catholic, or Anabaptist martyrs. But what I thought was these things really need to be understood and interpreted together. And so that was really what lay behind the genesis for the dissertation. As I started to read more sources, the superabundant source material was just astounding. And it was just thrilling as a graduate student. I would compare notes with colleagues who had projects that were what one of my professors at Princeton called needle in a haystack dissertation projects, where you go to the archives, you're hoping for this specific kind of evidence, and if it's not there, what do you do? That was not my problem at all. There was never, ever a shortage of things to read. Such rich source material, so many interesting critical questions to ask, and so forth. So I wanted to study Anabaptist, Catholic, and Protestant martyrs in the Reformation era together. And the guiding question that I wanted to make sure that I asked, regardless of who I was talking about, whether I was talking about somebody willing to die, whether I was talking about somebody willing to kill, whether I was talking about interpreters, distinguishing between, by their respective criteria, true versus false martyrs, I was always going to ask the question, what did it mean to them, whoever they were? And by shifting and doing that, I think in a consistent way, methodologically, I showed that something could be done with an extraordinarily contentious, super fraught situation in the 16th century, and yet you could do justice to the respective protagonists that you were dealing with. So I did most of the research for the dissertation in the early 90s. I had a junior fellowship at the Harvard Society of Fellows, which is when I finished the dissertation, and in 1996, and took up my first position at Stanford. It was published then by Harvard University Press in 1999. Also, the title of the dissertation was, and this would have doomed it, of course, to go to the remainder stack of every bookseller in the world had I stuck with it, was The Anathema of Compromise. Right? So, very precise and actually quite good, I think, title, but no, that's not going to win. Salvation at Stake, that's just the double entendre that we were looking for. So the framework of the book is, in order for martyrdom to be significant, I think, in any cultural context or religious tradition, you have to have the notion, it has to exist, there has to be such a thing as martyrdom understood. There have to be authorities who, when push comes to shove, whatever the specifics are involved, authorities have to be willing to put people to death for their convictions. You have to have people who demonstrate their willingness to die in those situations. And then, crucially, and this goes back to the anecdote about Raymond Lull, there have to be people who interpret the deaths as martyrdoms and memorialize them, talk about them one way or another. And what's, as I was mentioning before, what seems to me quite distinctive about the Reformation era in Western Europe is that you've got this contestation about what true Christianity is. At the same time, that you've got men and women in the respective three broad traditions demonstrating their willingness to die in this fraught situation of doctrinal contestation. So first then, you have to have the concept. And of course, it's not the late Middle Ages that devises the notion of Christian martyrdom. It's deeply rooted in Scripture. Obviously, Christianity also is a distinctive tradition because you have a Savior who is also a martyr, who dies a brutal execution by crucifixion. This plays an enormously large part, as all medievalists know, especially in the late Middle Ages, in terms of devotion to Christ's passion. We see very wide range of different expressions and exaltations of the virtue of patience, of suffering, identification, affective identification with Mary as the Mater Dolorosa. This is the high tide of the Pietà, for example. There is a widespread emphasis from the early 15th century on, also the ars moriendi, the art of dying well. So what's interesting to me about the late Middle Ages is that even though active opportunities for Christian martyrdom within Latin Christendom had diminished essentially in proportion as Christianization had advanced, martyrdom becomes a possibility of only the kind of fringes, the kind of missionary fringes of Latin Christendom. Nevertheless, you've got these sensibilities and also the extraordinary ubiquity of ancient martyr saints present in all kinds of prayers and images and so forth. So as I try to argue in this passage, or this chapter, about the late medieval context for the resuscitation, the renaissance of Christian martyrdom in the Reformation era, this is a religious culture that is, it's less devoid of martyrdom than it is replete with its possibility. And so once the situation shifts in the early 1520s and you get the first executions for rival views of what Christian truth is, all the elements are there for there to be a kind of instant resuscitation of Christian martyrdom. And we see a sort of prefiguration of that with certain late medieval groups, Lollards and Waldensians and Hussites, several of whom are executed for their religious convictions and in a preprint context celebrated respectively as martyrs. The other next component that one has to have, you have to have authorities who, when in one or another situation, despite their best efforts to try to persuade people to recant their respective convictions, are willing to put people to death. And this, in some ways, probably, I think probably some readers found this the most provocative of following through in a consistent methodological way, answering the question, what did it mean to them? Because for the authorities involved, they were not, I don't think any authorities in the 16th century thought that they were persecuting anyone. They were prosecuting what were regarded at the time as serious, deadly crimes. Crimes that, for the sake of judicial consistency, in a legal context in which, for example, if rape or poisoning or counterfeiting is punishable by death, well then for sure obstinate heresy is punishable by death, because of course you're endangering somebody's, not just someone's, but indefinitely many people's eternal salvation. And in that context, the demands of being a public authority, looking out for the common good, you try to do everything you can, as it were, to save people from themselves. And that's one of the really remarkable things I think that's unexpected for many people. This is not a campaign to just slaughter the deviant, the way that we see it, for example, in quite a few 20th century regimes. Multiple attempts are made, many cases, to try desperately to persuade. It's like the Dominicans couldn't do it, so the Franciscans come in. They have a try. The civic authorities come in. They can't persuade these people. So actually, executions for religious obstinacy, from this perspective, is actually a political defeat for every situation. What the authorities want are recantations. They don't want executions. I talk a bit in here. I mean, obviously, it's not a single kind of mechanical process in all countries and all times. There are a lot of local variations and so forth. I talk about that in this chapter as well. The chapter on the martyrs themselves, kind of the martyr sensibilities, based largely on prison writings where we have them. I do some kind of source critical stuff in the first chapter to make a case for the reliability of the sources as we have them, as nearly as we can tell. And what's really striking are how similar the core sensibilities of Catholics, Protestants, and Anabaptists are. They quote the same biblical passages. They evince the same kinds of familial and co-believer relationships to one another. They're receiving letters from family members exhorting them to stay strong. They're sending letters to people saying, I haven't forgotten you, and so forth. So the ways in which both a reliance on Scripture and the social kind of networks that sustain the martyrs is extraordinarily consistent across all three of these traditions. The other thing that's really interesting, and again, this was all kind of things I just found out by reading lots and lots of sources across the three traditions. All of them have a strong sense of identification with ancient Christian martyrs on the one hand, and also refer to biblical martyrs. The Maccabees, of course, to Jesus himself, to Stephen, the first proto-martyr in the book of Acts, and so forth. And then they see their co-believers who are being executed for the faith as a kind of, this is the latter-day act, the continuation of that ancient tradition now also under the providence of the same God who had sustained the ancient martyrs is doing so in the present. So when you look at the martyrs comparatively across all three traditions this way, their sensibilities, the behaviors they engage in, the writing of letters, the encouraging one another and so forth, extraordinarily similar across all three of the traditions. After that, there are three long chapters respectively devoted to Protestant, Anabaptist, and Catholic martyr recognition and memorialization. And these are the chapters where the emphasis is on what's distinctive about each of these three. To simplify enormously, they're 60, 65-page chapters each. So I'm compressing tremendously here. Protestants want to insist on the etymological meaning of the word martyr, right? Witness. Biblically rooted, absolutely. But they want to distance themselves from any sense of martyr saints as intercessors. And so they're claiming, right, a kind of direct biblical connectedness of those who are being put to death in the present for what they regard as the restored, recovered gospel, while also disavowing and distancing themselves from any sense, for example, that the martyrs are doing something that's meritorious or that there is any basis for those who are left behind invoking the martyrs and so forth. I work in that chapter from the earliest 1520s German and Latin martyr pamphlets that are published starting already in 1523 up through the mid-century major martyrologies, the ones if people know anything about or have even heard about anything related to Christian martyrdom in the 16th century, it's usually John Fox's Book of Martyrs. There's also the French kind of parallel to that, Jean Crespin. Adrian von Heemstede has the Dutch version, and then there's a Lutheran German martyrological compiler, Ludwig Rabus, and I also deal with him. So these mid-century martyrologies that are then republished many times in the later 16th and into the 17th centuries. Anabaptist martyrdom is different. These are not kind of extraordinary witnesses for the gospel, but because of the lack of sustained political protection for Anabaptists almost everywhere in Western Europe in the 16th and into the early 17th century, for Anabaptists, simply to be a follower of Christ is to be vulnerable as a martyr. You know, they have persecuted me, they will persecute you as well. And so by far the largest percentage of those who are executed for their convictions among the three traditions in the 17th century in Western Europe, excluding the missionary fields for Catholics in other areas, because I think we're going to hear a few comments about that in a few minutes. There are many, many more for huge numbers of Catholics that are killed in early 17th century Japan, for example. But in Western Europe, by far the largest number of these three traditions are Anabaptist martyrs. They also are, with the exception, the Dutch Mennonites to some extent have a quite substantially literary tradition of martyrological recognition and memorialization, in some respects analogous to the Protestants. But the German-speaking Anabaptists, both the Hutterites, the Swiss Brethren, they sing songs. Hundreds of songs about enduring persecution, songs about memorializing the martyrs as well. So somebody said, they read these three chapters, they said, so the Protestants publish martyrologies, the Anabaptists sing songs, and the Catholics make paintings and pictures. That's, it's not exclusively that, but there's something, there's an emphasis in each of the three big traditions along those lines. And of course, for Catholicism, there are the fewest impediments, as it were, as far as continuities with late medieval Christian sensibilities. I mean, it's simply, in many respects, those sensibilities carry through. But this really moves, the chapter is mostly focused on 16th century England, Henrician and Elizabethan England, and then to a lesser extent also the Low Countries. The disruptions in the late 1560s, 1570s especially, sees a significant number of Catholics, mostly but not exclusively priests, who are killed in the conflict between the Netherlands and Spain. This then, in the final chapter before the conclusion, takes up the question of how the discourse of competing rival martyrological traditions, right, plays out in the Reformation era. Because to be recognized as a true martyr means to die for the correct convictions and not the wrong ones. Augustine's dictum, it's not the punishment, but the cause that makes the martyr, is functionally applied by martyrologists and controversial theologians in all three traditions to shore up their respective martyrological communities in ways that end up strengthening confessional identities in very strong ways, but also preclude the possibility that, for example, simply the way in which somebody met death could be sufficient reason to regard them as a martyr. And that's why even the antagonistic interpreters of public executions, those who regard people dying as for false claims, they have no problem talking about how they meet death in extraordinarily brave ways, how they face the flames without problems whatsoever, because that doesn't matter. Die for the wrong reasons, you're a false martyr. And of course, it's the reasons, the rival doctrines, that are at the source of the disagreements to begin with. The effect of this, I think, in some pretty powerful ways, is that the rival martyr traditions of the Reformation era play a very important part in the kind of constituting of rival confessional identities, mutually exclusive confessional identities throughout the remainder of the early modern period into the modern era. I just anecdotally will share briefly, in the early 2000s, a couple of times I was involved in some ecumenical discussions between Catholics and Mennonites about the 16th century and specifically about, and I can guarantee you, there are some Mennonites for whom what happened in the 16th century is still a substantial, it's a substantial stumbling block to making progress on ecumenical interactions. It's still an important part of their identity. And then I think over the long term, this was something that I really, when I wrote my next book, the unintended Reformation, I realized that certain things that I had just barely adumbrated at the very end of Salvation at Stake, about the ways in which this kind of intransigence, this demonstrated willingness of substantial numbers of people willing to die for their respective religious convictions, inadvertently, unintentionally played a part in the eventual redefinition and constriction of the role that any notion of shared religious convictions could play in religiously pluralist societies. So that martyrdom, the insistence of the martyrs and their interpreters and their defenders and so forth, the intensity and the unwillingness to compromise in the Reformation era ends up inadvertently, over the long term, contributing to processes of secularization that the protagonists at the time would have certainly not been in favor of. So let me just say a couple things here at the end. That's basically the overview of the book, done informally in 20 minutes or thereabouts. When I was working on martyrdom, people were like, "What? That's like religious fanatics, weirdos. That has really nothing to do with our world." I guess if you study people that's lived 500 years or 400 or 500 years ago, you must be kind of a weird person yourself. Anyway, this is in the wider public, of course. Among historians, that's just normal behavior for us. But 9/11, I think, really brought this whole issue into not just the headlines, but into people's awareness in an unexpected way. Because it was pretty clear that these were people who, say what you will about them, there's absolutely no question they were motivated by religious convictions as they understood these in ways that were sufficient to motivate them to fly airplanes into the two towers. And there were people who interpreted the people that did that as heroes. Right? These were true martyrs, according to some people, right? So, I mean, when I saw this happen, I thought, yeah, of course, that's just how it works. That's how it worked in the 16th century too. But what it did was bring this notion of publicly accessible, in-your-face issues about religious violence, politics, and martyrdom into, right, it pushed it into center stage in a new way. I'm sure all of us here are aware, not just specifically with respect to Christianity, because that's the tradition I work on. In recent decades, there's been a major uptick in important respects, particularly in some majority Muslim countries, not all, but some. In India and in China, persecution of Christians, that certainly hasn't gone away. We all know, of course, since October 7th of 2023, a major upturn both of anti-Semitism and of Islamophobia in ways that are related to religious violence as well. And this is a separate point, but I think it bears kind of thinking about in certain respects in conjunction with some of these issues as well. The sort of, how could I put it? The intransigent hard edge to certain strands of religiosity and of religious believers in the United States, I think is significantly responsible for turning off many, particularly young people, from religious practice that maybe in previous generations would have sort of gone along with what was expected in the family or whatever the case may be. I mean, in short, I just think this is partly my own experience anecdotally, but also based on some things that I've read. My colleague Christian Smith at Notre Dame has done a lot of work on this too. Basically, if that's what religion is, I don't want anything to do with it. That doesn't sound to me like the gospel. I don't think that seems like the way that Christians ought to act and so forth. So I think that process of a certain kinds of religion turning people off or contributing unintentionally in secularizing ways is something that's still going on as well. Yeah, just a couple things here. People still read this book in Reformation history, right? At least Carlos makes his students read it. But I think it's it's probably the book that's best known about martyrdom and the Reformation. There's lots of other stuff too, but it's, it tries to see the phenomenon in Western Europe as a whole. I think there's much less of that sort of kind of theory first methodological reductionism than there was in the late 80s and early 90s when this book was written. And when I read the book now and I think, gosh, yeah, I really was kind of hammering away at that pretty hard. More scholars take lived religion more seriously now than I think was the case a generation ago. We're at BC, so I mentioned this thing about American Catholicism. Yeah, I think that, you know, so much of American history, Catholics want a place at the table, then they got a place at the table, and then it was like, well, why bother to be Catholic anymore, right? Because we're all affluent and happy and do whatever we want to. Now that's a, you know, far too flippant a comment about, but I think I see some nodding heads, so I'll just leave that there. And of course, I mean, at our current moment, we've got we've got issues with religion and politics in a big way. I don't know whether everybody's going to bring up Charlie Kirk in the comments afterward, but that whole thing about, you know, this assimilating him to and understanding him as a martyr too was just, I mean, I was talking with a couple of colleagues of mine who also work on martyrdom, and we were just like, so the issues remain alive. The phenomena underlying what transpired in the 16th century, I think, is still with us, albeit in dramatically transformed ways. And I've gone on long enough, so I'm going to stop there, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Gregory. So I think the way Steve proposed to do this is that I'll just introduce all the panelists at once. They can give their reflections in order, and then from there, I think we're opening it to general discussion. Is that right? Okay. Professor Mooney, I don't think should need much of an introduction here at the Clough School, where she's been a beloved teacher of many students of church history, including myself, for some time. She received her PhD from Yale and has studied medieval Christianity. She's published many articles in this area and has written a standout biography of Clare of Assisi, as well as a biography of Philippine Duchesne, a member of the Society of the Sacred Heart. Professor Mooney is also the president of the Hagiographical Society and on the advisory council for the Bollandist Society. She also has an admirable record of service for human rights efforts. She's on the board for the Ignacio Martin Barro Fund for Mental Health and Human Rights and circulates a newsletter to a wide following about the ongoing struggle for justice for the Huichi Amerindians of northern Argentina. Professor Emanuele Colombo is a professor at the Lynch School of Education, as well as a research scholar in the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies here at Boston College after a 14-year teaching career at DePaul University. Professor Colombo's research, broadly speaking, is on the Society of Jesus and particularly on the Litterae Indipitae, and he leads the digital Indipitae database project. He has published scores of articles and I think about a dozen books as well, including most recently Quando Dio chiama, I Gesuiti e le missione nelle Indie. And Father Robert Carbonneau, now an archival specialist at the Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History at Boston College, joined us following his time as an expert professor at Sichuan International Studies University and as the executive director of the U.S.-China Catholic Association in Berkeley, California. In his research, teaching, and writing, Father Carbonneau has used the Passionist China collection, which is now housed at the Ricci Institute, to study the Passionists in China and the relationship between American Catholic missionaries and the U.S. Department of State in pre-1955 China. Welcome our speakers, please.
When we try to imagine 16th century Europe, one of the hardest things to grasp is that thousands of men and women, perhaps as many as 5,000, chose death over denying their faith. 5,000. To modern readers in secular cultures, that defies comprehension. And yet their deaths inspired an extraordinary outpouring of pamphlets, woodcuts, and martyrologies within each confessional world, Protestant, Anabaptist, and Catholic. Each tradition cultivated its own memory of suffering, and in doing so, created and solidified its own distinct community of conviction and belonging. Salvation at Stake, published 25 years ago, remains a landmark in historical scholarship. It is a profoundly erudite and original work of cross-confessional religious history, and still the first genuinely comparative study of early modern martyrdom. I see Gregory's book as having two great arcs, one narrating the martyr traditions of Protestants, Anabaptists, and Roman Catholics, the other methodological, his argument about how historians should approach the study of belief itself. I'll return to this second arc in my conclusion. To modern readers in secular cultures, martyrdom seems baffling, foolishly heroic at best, dangerously fanatical at worst. Gregory insists that to get martyrdom, we must get the martyr's religiosity. To fail to understand them in their own religious terms is to fail utterly to comprehend them, their behavior, and their convictions. For Brad Gregory, the martyr's willingness to die cannot be fully explained by the kinds of modern theories that have often dominated historical writing: social psychology, anthropology of religion, or sociological accounts that treat faith as a symptom of deeper material or psychological forces. He takes direct aim at historians who, as he sees it, explain away rather than explain religious belief, turning conviction into pathology and ideology. Against such reductionism, Gregory insists that these men and women acted intelligibly within their own 16th century world, a world that prized eternal salvation above earthly life. As he writes, quote, "Unlike prolonging one's earthly life, fidelity to God was an absolute value," close quote. I share Gregory's caution, though I'm somewhat less distrustful of newer cultural and social scientific efforts to explore how belief works in people's lives. These approaches can help us understand the people of the past without dismissing their convictions, if we use them to illuminate and not to flatten a deeply religious world. In contrast to confessionally based scholarship that can myopically mischaracterize confessions not their own, Gregory's comparative study shows striking similarities across the confessions. All drew on a New Testament conviction that discipleship was costly. Indeed, it could cost you your life. Those who suffered martyrdom embodied the imitation of Christ and thereby gained heavenly reward. Protestants and Catholics both distinguished between true and false martyrs. The true died for sound doctrine, the false for falsehood. As Augustine had said, quote, "It is not the punishment, but the cause that makes the martyr." Protestants who held to the central doctrine that salvation came through faith alone and not by good works, which the Catholics still upheld, confronted a theological puzzle. If salvation was by faith alone, then how could dying for one's faith have spiritual value? Isn't dying for something doing something, therefore amounting to a work? Protestants could resolve this tension by insisting that their martyrs did not earn their salvation through the act of martyrdom. Rather, Their suffering and deaths proved the authenticity of their faith and God's grace working within them. The Anabaptists lived with intense apocalyptic expectation. Many believed the end of days was imminent. Persecution itself confirmed that they were the true elect. Their communities relied heavily on oral testimony and hymn singing. Songs celebrating martyrs were often memorized and passed from place to place. Gregory demonstrates that even when Anabaptists were illiterate, they could still articulate their beliefs with remarkable clarity when interrogated. They were not the naive peasants some earlier scholars might posit, but men and women who knew precisely what they believed and why. The Catholics were late to join the enthusiasm for martyrdom. As Gregory puts it, quote, unlike their early evangelical and Anabaptist counterparts, the Catholic martyrs in England, like Thomas More, had not died as part of a movement. Rather, they had stood still while the world around them moved. Close quote. That changed with the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent. From the Elizabethan martyrs of England to Jesuit missionaries who died in Asia and the Americas, Catholics entered a new militant phase. Plays in Jesuit colleges, the public display of relics, religious art, and liturgical prayers all heightened devotion to recent Catholic martyrs. By the end of the century, the veneration of new saints was part and parcel of the Catholic Church's self-understanding and its counterattack against Protestant gains in Europe. Across all three confessions, one sees both tragedy and irony. Persecutors and victims alike believed the truth was absolute and that God required them to defend it, whether by dying or by killing. Gregory explores not only the martyrs' willingness to die, but also their persecutors' willingness to kill. Most rulers and churchmen preferred persuasion to executions, but when faced with stubborn dissent, they believed themselves responsible for protecting their subjects' souls from the contagion of false belief. To them, coercion was an act of pastoral care. To us, the logic might be chilling, but Gregory shows that within their own moral universe, it made quite a lot of sense. These were people for whom eternal life and eternal damnation were real and imminent concerns. Before Salvation at Stake, martyrdom studies were often divided along confessional lines. Each tradition wrote about its own heroes. Brad Gregory broke that pattern. He identifies and responds to several schools of earlier scholarship. There were the early doctrinally oriented scholars for whom the Reformation was chiefly a matter of theology. Yet Gregory reminds us that the martyrs understood themselves not only as souls striving for salvation, but as embodied individuals living within concrete social worlds. To the social and political historians who see religion as a camouflage for issues of power or social class, Gregory replies that belief counted deeply. No one faces the stake to gain power or improve their social status, but they will die for a deeply held belief. In this sense, Salvation at Stake helped create a new kind of religious history, comparative, cross-confessional, and intellectually empathetic. Gregory's methodological reflections form, in a sense, the book's second arc, broached in the first and last chapters and interwoven throughout the book. He rejects a hermeneutic of suspicion, preferring a hermeneutic of understanding. He urges us to interpret his subjects' actions in the terms they themselves would have recognized. He also challenges as deeply anachronistic the notion that religious toleration could have settled the 16th century's disputes and violence over truth. Each tradition saw its truth claims as divinely revealed. Compromise would have seemed a profound betrayal. Gregory urges social historians to weave doctrine and spirituality back into their narratives, not as an ornament on the fabric of history, but as threads integral to its very weave. Rather than isolating faith from culture, his method seeks to reconstruct an integrated world of belief, practice, and community. He ends by noting that the unresolved religious conflicts of the Reformation helped give birth to the Enlightenment, an era in which dying for belief came to seem fanatical rather than faithful. But Salvation at Stake invites readers to reflect, for what would we be willing to risk death or even to suffer for something that is larger than ourselves? The book's power lies not only in its erudition, but in its moral imagination. Gregory's even-handedness allows readers to hear 16th century Protestants, Anabaptists, and Catholics in their own voices. That same spirit of patient listening has animated the work of the Bollandists for 4 centuries. Those studious Jesuits and other scholars who, since the early 17th century, have approached the lives of the saints with both devotion and critical rigor. In a sense, Salvation at Stake is a work in that same grand tradition of the Bollandists, a deeply historical, deeply human inquiry into the ways faith takes shape in time and sometimes in fire. So as we mark the 25th anniversary of Salvation at Stake, we celebrate a book that dared to take religion seriously in an age that often wants to explain it away. Brad Gregory's Martyrs remind us that conviction, however unsettling, has a history, and that history still speaks to us. By recovering the integrity of their world, Gregory gives us tools to understand our own, to engage those whose certainties differ from ours, not with condescension, but with curiosity and respect. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of Salvation at Stake, that empathy and conviction need not be enemies. The martyrs lived that truth, and the rest of us are still learning it. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm very, very happy to be here, and especially with my great friend, Brad Gregory. Salvation at Stake reminds me of my first time in the United States. As you can probably hear, I was not born in this country, and as an Italian postdoc, I decided to spend a few months at a prominent university in South Bend, whose name we are not allowed to mention here at Boston College. And during my stay, I had the chance to read the book and discuss it with Brad Gregory. And my English was so poor that I didn't understand the play on words of the title, and Brad has to explain it to me. But when I got it, I was so excited that it stayed with me. And a few years later, at DePaul University, I wanted to create a similar play on words, and I had to decide a title for a new class in church history, and I proposed A Faith to Die For. Unfortunately, it was not approved by the administration. Today, I want to talk about the evolution. So after the publication of Salvation at Stake, what happened? And I would like to say that the book has been a guide, a sort of roadmap to study martyrdom, not only in Europe, as Brad Gregory did, but also outside Europe in the so-called Indies, in the mission lands. And I will try to do that by showing 5 points, if I can make it with the time, identifying certain ideas that develop from the book, but bringing something more geographically and also chronologically. The first point is called a unique phenomenon, and I will not repeat what has already been said. Brad Gregory was able to show in the book how martyrdom is a unique phenomenon for which we need to ask the question, and this is a quotation, what did it mean to them? Fundamentally, my approach seeks simply to answer the question, what did it mean to them, going against a certain presentism that was there, but I would say is still there, especially outside of the United States when we look at religious phenomena. And I think that the definition of martyrdom that was already mentioned is the most important thing, and will come back a lot. Not the punishment, but the cause makes a martyr. Because if this is the definition of martyrdom, it means that historians who want to look at martyrdom cannot look only at the facts, cannot look only at the actions, but need to understand the intentions. What did people want to do? What did they think in order to get the definition of martyrdom? And this requires a lot of work, a lot of research. This is not true only for today's historians. It was true also for people who, in the early modern period, wanted to define martyrdom. What you see here is the first global martyrology of the Society of Jesus by Matthias Tanner, published in 1675. There are about 300 portraits of martyrs divided with a geographical criterion: Europe, Africa, America, and Asia. The 300 engravings are there showing the violence and the endurance in front of death, and they are very important to move people. But the text try through eyewitnesses to understand the intentions of the victim and the intentions of the perpetrators. So whoever wanted to write a martyrology has to ask the same question. What did it mean to them? The same method. The second point is called desire for martyrdom. There is not only the willingness to die and the willingness to kill, there is also something that was born before the moment of martyrdom, and is the desire for martyrdom. And I will talk today mainly of the Catholic environment and the Society of Jesus to honor the place that is hosting us. In the Jesuit novitiate, Sant'Andrea al Quirinale, the most important novitiate in Europe, a series of frescoes with all martyrs from the early church until the martyrs of the 15th and 16th century were in the room, in the recreation room. What a better way to do some rest and recreation. And the same young Jesuits who were spending their free time in this room were learning to write and read in Latin through a book, this fantastic book called Quinque Martires, 5,000 hexameters, a book in poetry, in which the story of Rodolfo Acquaviva, killed in India at the end of the 16th century, was told in the same way in which Virgil wrote his Aeneid. So the idea was the myth of martyrs was taught, was communicated even in the classroom. But also, most of these Jesuits participated in the great canonization ceremonies of 1622. Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, 2 non-martyrs were celebrated with paintings all over the world, paintings of the Jesuit martyrs in the mission lands. This is the identity of the Society of Jesus. And we can find references to martyrdom in the already quoted Littere Indipete, applications to the missions in distant lands that European Jesuits were writing to their superior. We have 25,000 of them from the 1560s to the Second Vatican Council, and martyrdom is very present in these letters, the desire for martyrdom. Some of these letters are written in blood to show that the people who were trying to live were ready to give their life. The desire for martyrdom, this is something that is noted in the book by Brad Gregory, is particularly important for the Catholic tradition, because in the Catholic tradition, martyrdom was not only resistance to a power who was against the right doctrine, was also an imitation of Christ, an act of love. And the arts, the images, are so powerful because there is something really impressive. At the same time, there is suffering, but also the peace of being with God, of being imitators of Jesus. You can see that in the expression in the face. Finally, the desire for martyrdom introduces another very important balance. You can desire martyrdom, but you cannot look for it. You cannot seek martyrdom. And this is particularly interesting in some of the stories. Antonio Criminali, who died in 1549 in India, was called the proto-martyr of the Society of Jesus, but his name was removed because witnesses said he was looking for martyrdom. He was too eager to die, and so this cannot be considered real martyrdom. Third point, comparing martyrdom in the Catholic world. The comparison that Brad Gregory did with the three Christian traditions can be done also internally within the Catholic world. Martyrdom is not a monolithic category in the Church. In 1597, 26 Christians, including 3 Jesuits and 23 Franciscans, were arrested in Kyoto, and after being forced to march on foot to Nagasaki, were martyred for their faith. This event was very significant for Europe and was represented in very interesting ways that I will show with some images. Franciscans depicted only Franciscan martyrs. And you see, this is a beautiful painting I saw recently in Cusco, Peru. This is a Japanese representation of Franciscans, and some engravings that even in the caption talk about the Franciscan martyrs. And of course, Jesuits represented the 3 Jesuit martyrs. There was not a problem of saying that the other were false martyrs, but the censorship was speaking for itself. They didn't exist. Not only that, there was also a different ideas, a different conception of martyrdom. Martyrdom was always connected to the salvation history, but while Franciscans look at martyrdom in a sort of apocalyptic way, as the sign for the second coming, looking at martyrdom as the sign for the future, the Jesuits were connecting martyrdom with the early Christians. The Society of Jesus, born in Montmartre, the month of the martyrs, the apostles, the new apostles, always look at the past, and they call Ignatius of Loyola the other Ignatius, referring to Ignatius of Antioch. So this archaeological view of martyrdom. Martyrdom influenced time, but also a new understanding of space, creating a geography of martyrs. Let's go back to Tanner. It's surprising, but not that surprising, that most of the martyrs are in Asia and especially in Japan. Even if the mission in Japan was short-lived and closed the borders to European missionaries as early as the 1630s. The same anomaly appears in the Indipete. The candidates to the mission lands keep asking for Japan in the 16th and 17th, early 18th century, even when they know that it's impossible to go there. Why? The reason Japan was considered a unique place in the geography of martyrs lies once again in the definition of martyrdom, not the punishment, but the cause makes a martyr. While in many mission lands, especially in America, it was not always easy to prove that a missionary's death was a result of his faith and not his association with European colonizers. the cause of the violence in Japan was crystal clear. Christians faced the choice of recanting their faith and surviving, or refusing to recant and being tortured and killed. Similar to early Christians, the intentions of the executioners and victims were obvious. The fumi, 17th century, which Japanese Christians were asked to trample on, was the equivalent of the libellus, which marked the sacrifices of early Christians to pagan gods. And this is a beautiful emblem celebrating the centenary of the Society of Jesus, in which Jesuits burnt alive in Japan are compared to Christians persecuted by Nero. The last point is called the long period. I have a kind of different take on the long period from what has been presented by Brad, I think complementary. And there are two ideas. First, the canonization of the martyrs opens a new chapter, which I think is very important for the Society of the Bollandists, supporting, organizing this event. Because of the difficulty of identifying true martyrdom, we have a fluctuating view. Urban VIII making difficult the canonization of the martyrs, which in fact didn't happen in the early modern period. Benedict XIV, who introduced the idea that a miracle was necessary to attest, to prove the truth of martyrdom, a healing through the body of the martyr or something similar. So the miracle that was not necessary per se for martyrs became again necessary to prove the truth of martyrdom. And then the idea that most of the martyrs of the early modern period were beatified and canonized only 200 years later, in the 19th century, especially under Pius IX, with a new interpretation. They are part of the global, the collective martyrdom of the Catholic Church, which is now attacked by anti-clerical forces. So a new way of looking, of thinking, and this process continues until the pontificate of John Paul II. The second long-term development, since the desire of martyrdom was great, but the opportunity to die in odium fidei was very difficult, was very rare, there is the idea of expanding the category of martyrdom. Living in a religious community can be a martyrdom. Many people present here can say that. Dying while traveling to a mission land, or losing one's life while helping the sick. This is really like an underground riven within the Society of Jesus. Teofilo Reynaud, the new Bellarmine, they called him, published a book, De Martyrio per Pestem. People who died because they were taking care of the sick should be considered martyrs. The Inquisition censored the book and condemned the book, and the Curia, the Church of Rome, resisted this expansion of the meaning of martyrdom. But again, and I'm concluding, this is an underground river, and it's interesting to look at it. In 1966, the former Jesuit von Balthasar published his famous book, Cordula, translated into English as The Moment of Christian Witness. In a strong critique against another well-known Jesuit, Karl Rahner, Balthasar revisited this ancient debate. In his view, love for God, up to the readiness of martyrdom, came before the love for one's neighbor, and martyrdom could not be confused with any form of humanitarian generosity. The debate continued and took on a greater political overtones in the context of liberation theology and political violence in South America. The first Jesuit Pope, Pope Francis, somehow solved the debate with a motu proprio in 2017, in which he added a new possibility of becoming a saint through the offer of one's life. A simple thought to conclude: there is something wonderful in recognizing how a book has shaped generations of scholars who have used salvation at stake as a guide into the world of Christian martyrdom, highlighting its value across the world and throughout history. There is also something wonderful about revisiting a book and discovering that 25 years later, it has grown in depth and richness like a good Italian wine.
Well, this was truly an honor to read this book by Professor Gregory. For me, it was a tremendous, striking aspect because it forced me and invited me, really, to look at an area that I had not reflected on in years. And what struck me really was the narrative and the framing, as was explained, on the willingness to kill and the willingness to die. I thought that that was a tremendous invitation to deal with realities that I had been looking at, especially in light of Asia, and that's what I really want to reflect upon, building on the previous speaker and deal in some more concrete aspects, and I think expand the areas. I should say that that in the book content, one of the things that Professor Gregory does say is his intensity, well done scholarship, and arguments admittedly are not dealing with Asia. So he says, this is an area to investigate, but I can't handle this at this point. So I want to acknowledge that because many of these aspects are brought out in that regard. So it reminded me that, and this is something to think about, these narratives really that we've been talking about are hidden really in footnotes or texts or whatever language I think you're really looking at, but certainly this is true for the situation of Francis Xavier. George Schurhammer wrote this multi-volume history of Francis Xavier, and one of the things that struck me when I read this at some point in time was I was shocked, because I had no knowledge of this, at how many people actually, this whole idea of martyrdom was an ongoing phenomena through India, through the Malaccas, through Japan, and the violence of it really shocked me. Even this idea that traveling through the doldrums to India, where this idea of martyrdom, waiting for the winds and dying, all of these aspects were very real. So a person can really look at this whole period and be reintroduced to a language, to a culture, to a whole proximity of how missionaries and the public viewed each other in a contest, really, a competition with Muslims in the emerging period and just civil and local authorities and religious competitions between religious orders at the same time as it's all developing on the way to Japan. So this is a very key, books like this and studies like this are very important. I'd like to also talk a little bit about the idea of China and the saints in China. This is an important concept to keep in mind, because this whole area is now out of a Christian context, and we're starting to deal with what it means to be Confucian. And this is another dynamic here. The relationship between Confucian philosophy and Catholic thought is one that has to be taken into reality in its understanding. The Confucian idea really is different in Japan, it's different in China, and it's different in Korea. So the dispute was about the rituals of honoring one's ancestors. And essentially, if you wanted to become a Catholic, you had to give up the qualified ancestral religious rites, and that ended up being what they call the rights controversy. The simple aspect of this is that if you did give up, and if you gave up, wanted to become a Catholic, and you were interested in practicing the faith, here's at least 3 points you had to give up. During the spring and autumn worship of Confucius, together with the worship of ancestors, it's not allowed among Catholic converts. It's not allowed even though the converts appear in a ritual as bystanders, because to be a bystander in this ritual is a pagan to participate in its activity. Another point is no Chinese Catholics are allowed to worship ancestors in their familial temple. And another one is whether at home or in a cemetery or during the time of a funeral, a Chinese Catholic is not allowed to perform the ritual of ancestor worship. He is not allowed to do so even in the company of non-Christians. Such a ritual is heathen in nature, regardless of the circumstances. So essentially, the ancestor rites, as they're more properly called, meant that if you became a Catholic, you gave this up. This is a tremendous affirmation of faith, but it's a cultural disconnect from everybody else that you live with. I should say, though, in the Boxer Uprising of 1900, numerous Protestants and Catholics were killed. Now, I can say this, that the Boxer Saints were declared recently in 2000, and that was a very contentious proclamation because it set in process some political pushback from the Chinese government at that time, which was seen somewhat to be offensive. But I had a student in my class, Zhangzhen Liang, here at Boston College, who surprised, I think, all of us in class one day when she said that actually the Boxer Saints, one of the Boxer Saints was from her village, and she really feels the presence of that saint who died from her village in a daily experience. So this is a living testimony for the period today. I would like to say that also this challenged me for my own dissertation. I did my dissertation at Georgetown on the first 3 American Catholic priests who were killed in China, and they were proclaimed martyrs. And looking through my material, I couldn't find out really where they were martyrs, not martyrs, did they fit the definition of martyrs, and they were killed by bandits. So it was pretty much a political robbery in West Hunan, China in 1929. But immediately in the newspapers in 1929, almost a month and a half after their death, a poem was published that these were American Catholic martyrs. They were proclaimed as martyrs almost instantaneously, which you were talking about, Professor Gregory, that this now is emerging as a 20th century idea. Then it moves into foreign relations of the United States, where you see the apostolic delegate, Costantini, shows up in Washington, D.C. to talk about the role of American citizens. And Costantini says in 1931, if a missionary were killed, they regretted it, the Holy See, but they considered it, he had fallen in action in line of duty, and he'd become a martyr, and they were not inclined to make a disturbance about it. Essentially, the Holy See was not going to ask for indemnity, but they were considered to be martyrs. Hornbeck, who's from the State Department, says, that's fine, but they're American citizens. It may be assumed from the point of view of the church over a period of centuries, martyrdoms have assumed to be involved more of an advantage than a disadvantage. But you know what? They're American citizens, and we got to take care of them. So they eventually, what they did was they agreed to disagree on this policy of indemnity and ideas. So this is a very important aspect of how martyrdom shaped American foreign policy and the policy of the Holy See in the 20s. Also, then we move into the more modern period here, where we have Fulton Sheen, and he, in World Mission in 1953, talks about the definition of wet martyrs and dry martyrs. Wet martyrs are martyrs who die, and they are actually killed, but dry martyrs are ones who suffer persecution and long suffering in China, but they're released. So now the definition of martyrdom has changed. I should also say that during this period of time, there are martyrdoms taking place in Korea. Now, the Ricci Institute just got this book. It's in Korean, and it's a published persecution narrative of state Korean government narratives against Korean Catholics, and it's about 30 volumes. It's not even in the catalog yet. We just got this. So this is an important aspect of Korean martyrdom. And this is also discussed by Don Baker. So there's many people that still have to look at this idea. And what's unique about Korean Catholicism is it was brought by lay people to Korea, So that's a whole other different distinction than missionaries. And there's an idea that the government of Korea, the dynasty of Korea, was so upset with this intrusion of Western learning that they actually persecuted the books. So the books were dangerous as well as the people. I'd like to conclude here with this idea of another aspect of martyrdom with Takashi Nagai. And Takashi Nagai suffered through the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one of the things that he wrote an essay at actually, it was for 8,000 Catholic victims on the atomic bomb, and it was in November 23rd, 1945, at the Cathedral of the Assumption in Nagasaki. So this is very quickly after the bomb was dropped. And he says this: before this moment, there were many opportunities to end the war. Not a few cities were totally destroyed, but these were not suitable sacrifices, nor did God accept them. Only when Nagasaki was destroyed did God accept the sacrifice. Hearing the cry of the human family, he inspired the emperor to issue the sacred decree by which the war was brought to the end. Nagasaki ends this book called The Bells of Nagasaki with a celebration of the cathedral's Angelus bells. He writes, "The clear sound of those bells, ringing out the message of peace and its blessings. May there never again be a time when they do not ring. May they ring out the message of peace until the morning of the day in which the world ends." So what I'm trying to show here is that this idea of martyrdom that's addressed so well in Professor Gregory's book has expanded in Japan, in Korea, in also Vietnam, but also through these areas of diplomacy and even the horrendous aspect. And this was a controversial understanding of the dropping of the bomb, but it shows us that this idea of martyrdom has taken on many, many different dynamics since the time that was addressed in Professor Gregory's book. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just invite the panelists and Professor Gregory as well to come up. Maybe the panelists can be seated. I think, Professor Gregory, you have the roaming mic, so maybe you can stand. And we will take 3 questions for the number of the Trinity. It has nothing to do with the spread of the loss to Notre Dame over the weekend.
Sure. So I was wondering if there are examples of Protestants who were treated in a more Catholic, saint-like fashion after their death. And I have in mind in particular Bob Scribner's wonderful article about combustible Lutheran.
Yep.
So is there like an embodied version of that?
Yeah, there are, and again, I have to preface all this by saying, there was a time like 1999 and for a few years thereafter where I really had all this stuff right at my fingertips, right? So I'm grasping to try to remember some specific incidents. But the cover of the book itself shows the first 2 Augustinians who are executed in Brussels in 1523. And if you look at that image, they both have traditional Catholic halos, right, around their head. I mean, the kind of iconic, the most typical indicator that they're being seen and understood and recognized as saints. There are a number of examples as well of what I call relic behavior among Protestants who are executed. In other words, people, for example, gathering up the bones of those who've been burned, executed after the fact, talking about and treating them in ways that are very characteristic of traditional sensibilities in that regard. So the short answer is yes. There are a few examples of that in the chapter on Protestants.
Yeah, go ahead. Matthew.
How did events like the Munster Rebellion of the Anabaptist sect affect their conceptions of martyrdom?
Yeah, so this is the in the mid-1530s, for those of you who might not be up on Jan van Leyden and polygamy in Anabaptist context in the 16th century, so in 1534-35, there is a notorious incident, although I'm not going to go into the details about that. Suffice it to say that an Anabaptist regime comes into power not through conquest, but it's a complicated demographic shift. The men go, the women leave, the men stay, and they come into power. And they, very biblically, reinstitute Old Testament polygamy. Very biblically, the Acts of the Apostles, abandon private property. This horrifies both Catholic and Protestant authorities at the time, who in an early effort of de facto ecumenical cooperation combined military forces to besiege the Anabaptist city of Munster. It doesn't end well for them. The question about how does this affect issues related to martyrdom and so forth, anytime you've got a really dramatic upheaval like that, the same thing had happened in the immediate aftermath of the Peasants' War as well. That's when you have the worst prosecution of Anabaptists and evangelicals in Bavaria, for example, is 1526-27, immediately after the German Peasants' War. So too in the Low Countries and in northern Germany, immediately after the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. It's a very bad time to be an early Mennonite, for example, in the Low Countries, because political authorities' antennae are up, so to speak, right? And so that's, anytime you've got, we see something similar with the worst of the unrest in the Low Countries and immediately after the fighting in the late 1560s and early 1570s. That's when some of the most aggressive prosecutions for religious heterodoxy are found. So, yeah.
Thank you. Could you talk about the reception of King Charles I as a martyr?
Yeah, this is much later, right? I mean, this is, and after his execution in 1649. I saw you with the big book on Puritans there before, so you probably know quite a lot about this. So, I mean, the period of the English Civil Wars and the English Revolution is at the kind of the outside edge of what I was talking about and dealing with in the book. But it is, you'll know offhand. What is the icon? I can't remember the name of the famous pamphlet that treats Charles I as a martyr. Does anybody know it offhand? Econ Basilikis, or it's something like this. Yeah, is that right? Yeah. Okay, all right, good. Yeah, pulled that one out of somewhere, I don't know. There is an understanding among his supporters of the king as a martyr in the early 1650s, and that's basically all I can say about it, to be honest with you, off the top of my head. It's not. I was aware of it at the time. It's not something that I looked at and incorporated into the book per se. That was a pretty disappointing third question. Should we take one more? Please ask a question of one of the panel. The presentations were so good.
I'd like to ask one to tie a couple themes together here. I'm curious how you read something Emanuele mentioned about the 1597 martyrs in Nagasaki, right? So there are 26 who died. There are 3 Jesuits, kind of. There are 26 or 23 Franciscans, kind of.
Yep.
And then it sets off this kind of global battle to make them saints first. They're actually canonized on separate days eventually.
Yeah.
So how do you read, I guess, that dynamic? Because a lot of the book turns on, as rightly, Catholic, Anabaptist, and Protestant. What does that do, if anything, as you look back on the thesis of it?
Yeah, I want Emanuele to comment on this as well from his perspective. I am persuaded by scholars of hagiography and canonization to regard canonization as its own thing. In other words, the kinds of almost instantaneous celebration of, and Rob, your example of this was perfect for this in 1931 or whenever this incident was. It's like Who cares what the what the church officials say? He's a martyr, and we're writing poetry about him. You know, like it or leave it. I mean, that happens all the time in the 16th century. All the time. They're not waiting around. If you see somebody give their life for this, and you're supportive, you were there at the stake or the scaffold or whatever, you're grabbing a shred of their clothing, whatever the case may be. You're writing poetry about Edmund Campion, and etc. Canonization is another thing entirely. The Nagasaki martyrs are beatified in, I think, 1627. I think that's right. And the Gorkum martyrs from the Dutch Republic, killed in 1572, are beatified in 1675. That's it before 1700. From the entire, no Thomas More, no John Fisher, no Edmund Campion, not till 1935, the 400th anniversary of Fisher and More's death. Now, my kind of supposition about this, I didn't really go into this a lot, but I think it's partly because acts of official canonization let's say we're going to consider this in the 1570s or 1590s or 1610s or in 1622 when they could have done it. That is a provocative act of bridge burning. It is to say, right, we are, right, officially recognizing this in a way that I think goes beyond simply dealing with the fact that there's a spontaneous celebration of these outbreaks of piety per se, but I'm not sure that that's a sufficient explanation. But I think the history of canonization and the politics of canonization is really it's just a different thing. So often canonizations are so far removed from the time of the saint that they are, celebrating or recognizing. So anyway, that's my take on it, but there are probably people here who know more about this than I do, so.
No, I just want to add, it's interesting. This is the 17th century book I was talking about. I just took it from the library for tonight. Don't tell anyone. But what is interesting, no one of these 300 martyrs is canonized. They are celebrated. Sometimes there is a halo, which would be against the Council of Trent. And what is enough to do that is the Protestatio, these few lines at the end of the book, in which the author says this is not something that is the truth of faith, is what we think, as our popular view, and we celebrate it. So this is interesting because the internal politics of the religious orders is at play before the canonization. And then the other thing is that the documents of the trials, most of them in the 19th century, are very, very interesting because they, sometimes the trials started before because the trials started, but they didn't get to, and Urban VIII was one of the main responsibles. But when you get the trial, you see the attempt to create the continuity with the past. So this is what we started, we want to continue, but then you see also the interpretation, the new way of putting them together. And this is so. This too, that is another thing that tries to connect the past and the present, sometimes in a really beautiful way. So these documents are really fascinating.
With that, please join me in thanking our panelists and Professor Gregory.